What if I told you that every single night, in the few precious seconds before you drift off to sleep, you're standing at the threshold of the most powerful transformation tool you'll ever possess, and you've been walking past it your entire life without even knowing it was there? Think about this for a moment. Right now, as you're watching this video, your mind is racing with thoughts, decisions, worries, plans. Your consciousness is like a fortress with walls built high, guards stationed at every entrance, carefully filtering what gets in and what stays out. But tonight, just like every other night, something extraordinary is going to happen. Those walls will come down, those guards will step aside, and for a brief, almost magical moment, you'll have access to a level of your mind that during the day remains completely locked away from you. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Now, here's what most people don't realize. We spend roughly a third of our entire existence in sleep. That's 8 hours every single day where we think we're simply offline, recharging our batteries like we're nothing more than smartphones plugged into the wall. But what if I told you that ancient civilizations, the Egyptians, the Tibetan monks, the mystics of Alexandria, they knew something that modern science is only now beginning to whisper about? They understood that those hours aren't downtime at all. They're when the real work begins. Has this ever happened to you? You go to bed with a problem that seems absolutely impossible to solve, tossing and turning, your mind spinning in circles, getting nowhere, and then you wake up the next morning and suddenly, almost like magic, the answer is just there, clear as day. You didn't force it. You didn't work through it step by step. It simply arrived. Most people brush this off as coincidence, as their brain working in the background. But what if it's something far more profound than that? Stay with me here, because what you're about to discover might completely change how you think about sleep, consciousness, and your own untapped potential. That moment right before you fall asleep, that drowsy, dreamy threshold where you're not quite awake, but not yet dreaming. Scientists call it the hypnagogic state, but ancient wisdom keepers called it something else entirely, the gateway. And they spent centuries perfecting the art of using it deliberately, intentionally, to reshape reality itself. What if you could learn to plant specific seeds in that moment? Not random thoughts or worries, but carefully chosen declarations that would work on your behalf all night long, germinating in the darkness, growing roots so deep that by the time you wake up, fundamental changes have already begun taking place at levels you can't even see yet. What would you plant if you knew it would grow into your new reality? Let me take you back in time for a moment, because understanding where this knowledge comes from changes everything about how you'll use it tonight. When the ancient Egyptians constructed those massive pyramids with mathematical precision that still baffles engineers today, aligning them perfectly with Orion's belt and other celestial markers, do you think they did that just to impress future tourists? When Tibetan monks developed elaborate rituals specifically designed to be performed in the deepest hours of night, chanting mantras in complete darkness, were they just following tradition for tradition's sake? And when the alchemists of Alexandria, those mysterious figures working in hidden chambers by candlelight, guarded their secrets about consciousness and transformation so fiercely that they encoded their knowledge in symbols and metaphors, were they simply being dramatic? No. They had discovered something that our modern world, with all its technology and scientific advancement, is only now beginning to remember. They understood that the night isn't what we think it is. It's not a void, not an empty space where we simply power down and wait for morning. The night is a laboratory. A sacred, sophisticated laboratory where the raw materials of your consciousness become malleable. where the rigid structures of your waking identity soften like clay and water, where the very fabric of who you are and what's possible for you can be rewoven thread by thread. If this resonated with you, subscribe to this channel right now. What we've covered today is just the beginning. There's so much more depth to explore, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Think about the word laboratory for a second. A laboratory is where experiments happen, where elements combine in ways they never could. In nature alone, where transformation occurs under precise conditions. And that's exactly what's happening in your mind every single night. Except most people are running the experiment completely by accident. They're mixing random chemicals together. Worry from work, anxiety about money, replaying that awkward conversation from 3 days ago, and wondering why they wake up feeling worse instead of better, why their life seems stuck in the same patterns year after year. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Those ancient wisdom keepers weren't just theorizing about this. They tested it, refined it, passed it down through generations of initiates who proved they could handle the responsibility of such knowledge. They discovered that there's a specific language your sleeping consciousness understands, not the language of logic and reason that your waking mind speaks, but something far more primal, far more direct. It's the language of pure intention, of unwavering declaration, of planting a seed with absolute certainty that it will grow. Your conscious mind during the day is like a skeptical scientist, demanding proof before belief, questioning everything, protecting you from disappointment by reminding you of every past failure. But your mind at that threshold moment before sleep, it's like a child, open, trusting, absorbing everything as truth without judgment or resistance. And the implications of this are staggering because it means that for those few precious seconds each night, you have the power to bypass every defense mechanism, every limiting belief, every self-sabotaging pattern that's been running on autopilot for years, maybe decades. The ancient texts speak of this in metaphors. They talked about dissolving the ego, about the death that comes before rebirth, about crossing the threshold into the underworld. But strip away the mystical language, and you're left with something beautifully simple. Every night, your conscious self steps aside, and what remains is pure potential, ready to be shaped by whatever you choose to imprint upon it. This is the hidden truth behind every genuine transformation story you've ever heard. Behind every person who suddenly became successful, healthy, confident, abundant, they learned consciously or unconsciously how to work with this nightly window of opportunity instead of wasting it. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because understanding the mechanism is one thing, but knowing how to actually activate it in your own life tonight, that's where the real power lies. Write in the comments, I'm ready to activate this, if something inside you is already recognizing this truth. If you feel that shift happening as you're watching this right now. So let's talk about something you've probably experienced but never fully understood. You're lying in bed, mind racing, turning over some problem that seems to have no solution. Maybe it's a difficult decision at work. Maybe it's a relationship issue that feels impossible to navigate. Maybe it's a creative project where you've hit a wall so hard you're questioning everything. The harder you think about it, the more tangled it becomes. Your thoughts spiral, anxiety builds, and you eventually fall asleep exhausted from the mental wrestling match, feeling like you've failed to figure it out yet again. Then morning comes. You open your eyes, and something has fundamentally shifted. The problem that consumed you last night. The answer is just sitting there in your awareness, crystal clear, almost laughably obvious. The decision that tormented you for weeks suddenly feels natural, like there was never really a choice to begin with. One path simply feels right in a way you can't quite explain but absolutely trust. And here's what's fascinating. You didn't work through it step by step while you slept. You didn't dream about spreadsheets or have a vision of someone giving you advice. The solution simply arrived, fully, Ye formed as if it had been there all along, waiting for you to stop looking so hard. Most people experience this and think, weird, and move on with their day. But what if I told you this isn't some random quirk of brain chemistry? What if this is actually evidence of the most powerful transformation mechanism you have access to, operating perfectly, doing exactly what it's designed to do? The question isn't whether this works. You've already proven to yourself that it does. The question is, what would happen if you learned to activate this deliberately instead of waiting for it to happen by accident? Here's what's really going on behind the scenes. During your waking hours, you have what I call the Guardian Mind Standing Watch. Picture a hyper-vigilant security guard stationed at the entrance to your deepest consciousness, clipboard in hand, scrutinizing every single thought that tries to enter. This guard has one job: protect you from disappointment, from failure, from anything that might hurt, and it does this job extremely well, maybe too well. Every hopeful thought gets checked against your file of past failures. Every exciting possibility gets compared to that time you tried something similar and it didn't work out. Every declaration of "I can do this" gets immediately countered with a list of reasons why you probably can't. This guardian isn't your enemy. It genuinely thinks it's helping you, but what it's actually doing is keeping you trapped in an endless loop, where the only thoughts that make it through are ones that confirm what you already believe about yourself and what's possible for you. It's like having a bouncer at the door of a club who only lets in people who were already members last year. No new faces, no fresh energy, no possibility of the party evolving into something better than it's always been. But here's the beautiful part, the part that changes everything once you truly grasp it. When you reach that threshold moment before sleep, something remarkable happens. That guardian, for all its vigilance and dedication, finally clocks out for the night. It doesn't leave gradually or reluctantly. It simply steps aside because that's part of the natural rhythm of consciousness. And when it does, every single barrier between you and profound transformation dissolves like morning mist in sunlight. Suddenly, there's no voice telling you that what you want is impossible because you've never achieved it before. There's no comparison to past failures because the filing cabinet is closed. There's no skeptical analysis of probability because the analytical mind has gone offline. What remains is pure receptivity, an openness so complete that whatever you plant in that moment sinks directly into the fertile soil of your deepest being without encountering a single obstacle. This is why those morning insights feel so effortless, so obvious in retrospect. While you slept, while the guardian was away, your deeper intelligence had full access to resources and connections and possibilities that are always there but usually remain locked behind layers of conscious resistance. It could explore solutions your waking mind would have immediately dismissed as impractical. It could see patterns your analytical brain was too focused on details to notice. It could access knowing that doesn't come from logic, but from a deeper well of wisdom that everyone has, but few people ever tap into deliberately. And the implications of understanding this are absolutely massive because it means you're not stuck. It means that every pattern, every limitation, every belief about who you are and what you're capable of, all of it can be rewritten. Write in the comments, "The Guardian is stepping aside," if you're starting to see just how much power has been waiting for you to claim it. Now here's where this knowledge shifts from interesting theory to practical power you can use tonight. Because once you understand that this window of opportunity exists, once you recognize that there's a moment each night when your deepest consciousness becomes completely receptive, the natural next question is, what do you plant there? And this is where most people who stumble onto this truth make a critical mistake. They approach it like they approach everything else in life, with the same scattered, unfocused energy they bring to their daytime goals. They lie down thinking vaguely about wanting to be happier, healthier, more successful, and they wonder, Why nothing changes? It's like throwing a handful of random seeds into a garden and expecting a specific flower to bloom. What you need to understand is that this moment of receptivity is sacred, not because of some mystical reason, but because it's rare. You get it once per day, for maybe 30 to 60 seconds if you're paying attention, and it's either going to be used deliberately or it's going to be wasted on whatever random thought happens to be floating through your mind as you drift off. Most people waste it replaying their day, worrying about tomorrow, or mentally rehearsing arguments they'll never have. And then they wonder why their life feels like it's on repeat, why the same situations keep showing up in slightly different packaging year after year. But when you learn to work with this power intentionally, when you understand that you can plant a specific seed, a clear intention, a precise declaration in that fertile ground, and trust that it will germinate while you sleep, everything changes. And I mean everything, because what you're doing isn't just positive thinking or wishful hoping. You're accessing a level of consciousness that operates by completely different rules than your waking mind. Your daytime brain, brilliant as it is, functions like a linear processor. It thinks step by step, cause and effect, if this then that. It needs proof before belief. It wants to see the whole staircase before taking the first step. Your nocturnal brain? It doesn't work that way at all. While you sleep, while that conscious processor has powered down for the night, something else takes over. Something that doesn't think in lines, but in webs, in patterns, in connections that span your entire lifetime of experiences and beyond. This isn't some mystical force I'm describing. Modern neuroscience is finally catching up to what ancient wisdom keepers always knew. During sleep, your brain enters states where it can process information exponentially faster than during waking hours, where it can make connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information, where it can literally rewire neural pathways in ways that would take years of conscious effort during the day. Think about what this means. While you're lying there apparently doing nothing, your brain is running through scenarios at lightning speed, testing possibilities, exploring solutions, rebuilding the architecture of how you perceive and respond to reality. It's doing in hours what your conscious mind couldn't accomplish in months. And here's the kicker, it's doing this every single night, whether you direct it or not. The work is happening anyway. The transformation is occurring in one direction or another. The only question is whether you're steering it or letting it run on autopilot based on whatever dominated your thoughts as you fell asleep. This is why the same people keep getting the same results year after year. They're programming their nocturnal brain with the same inputs every night: stress about money, anxiety about relationships, replaying that embarrassing moment from 2015, and their brain, being the faithful servant it is, takes those inputs and says, "Okay, got it. This is what we're working with," and spends all night reinforcing those exact patterns, making them stronger, more automatic, more deeply embedded in the fabric of who you are. If this video gave you something valuable, hit that like button. It's a small gesture that helps this reach others who are searching for exactly what you just found. But imagine for a moment what happens when you flip this. When instead of falling asleep to worry, you fall asleep to a clear, powerful declaration of who you're becoming. When instead of rehearsing problems, you plant the seed of the solution. When instead of defaulting to limitation, you consciously choose expansion. Your brain takes that input with the same faithful dedication and goes to work making it real, building neural pathways that support it, highlighting opportunities in your waking life that align with it, literally reshaping your perception of what's possible until what once seemed impossible starts feeling inevitable. And this brings us to something crucial that determines whether this works or whether it becomes just another technique you tried once and abandoned. Write in the comments, "I choose what I plant." If you're recognizing that you've been programming yourself unconsciously and you're ready to take deliberate control of this process starting tonight. The crucial thing most people miss is that this isn't some abstract philosophical concept we're talking about here. This is measurable, verifiable, happening in your brain every single night. Those moments when you wake up with a solution that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, that's not magic. That's not coincidence. That's evidence of a processing system so sophisticated, so powerful, that it makes your conscious thinking look like a calculator compared to a supercomputer. And the beautiful irony is that you already have access to this supercomputer. You've had it your entire life, but nobody ever taught you how to give it the right instructions. Let me give you a way to think about this that makes it immediately clear what's happening. Imagine you have two computers sitting side by side. The first one, your daytime computer, is the one you're aware of using. You type on it, you click through programs, you watch it process information. Step by step. It's good at what it does: logical analysis, sequential problem solving, conscious decision making. But it has limitations. It can only run so many programs at once before it starts to slow down. It can only access files that are clearly labeled and easy to find. It works in a straight line, processing one thing after another. Now, the second computer, this is the one most people don't even know they have. It sits there quietly, barely humming in the background, while the first computer is running. But here's what's remarkable. This second computer is exponentially more powerful. We're not talking a little bit faster or slightly more efficient. We're talking about the difference between counting on your fingers and having access to artificial intelligence. This computer doesn't work in straight lines. It works in networks, in patterns, in connections that span across your entire database of lived experience. It can process thousands of variables simultaneously, run simulations you'd never consciously think to run, access memories and knowledge you didn't even remember you had stored away. But here's the thing about this second computer. It can only fully activate when the first one shuts down for the night. As long as your conscious mind is running, as long as that daytime computer is clicking away, the powerful one stays mostly dormant, humming quietly in the background, waiting for its turn. And every night, when you finally close your eyes and that conscious processor powers down, the second computer takes over. It boots up completely, and it goes to work with a speed and efficiency that would seem impossible if you tried to comprehend it with your waking mind. This is why you can go to bed completely stumped by a problem and wake up with the answer fully formed. It's not that some mystical force whispered it to you in your dreams. It's that your second computer, that infinitely more powerful processor, spent the night running through possibilities at lightning speed, testing scenarios, connecting dots that your daytime mind would never have put together because it doesn't have the capacity to hold all those variables at once. And when you wake up, the solution isn't presented to you as a logical argument you need to evaluate. It arrives as knowing, as certainty, as this is obviously what needs to happen, even if you can't explain exactly how you arrived at that conclusion. Now, here's where understanding this changes everything about how you approach transformation in your life. Most people spend their entire lives trying to force change through willpower during the day, using that first computer to manually reprogram themselves line by line, file by file. And it's exhausting, it's slow, it meets constant resistance because you're trying to change patterns while those patterns are actively running. It's like trying to renovate a house while you're still living in it, moving around furniture while people are sitting on it, tearing down walls that are currently holding up the roof. But when you learn to work with your second computer, when you learn to plant clear, specific instructions in that moment before sleep when it's about to take over, you're essentially giving it a blueprint and saying, build this while I rest. And it does. not through force or struggle, but through natural reorganization at a level where resistance doesn't even exist because your conscious mind isn't there to create it. The transformation happens behind the scenes, in the architecture of your consciousness, and by the time you wake up, changes have already begun taking root that your waking mind didn't have to fight for. This is the hidden truth behind every story of sudden breakthrough, every overnight success that actually took years of groundwork, every person who seemed to transform their life in an impossibly short time. They found a way to leverage that second computer, consciously or unconsciously. Write in the comments, both computers are now online, if you're beginning to see how much processing power you've been leaving untapped all these years. Now, you might be wondering why, if this knowledge is so powerful and so natural to how we're designed, it's not being taught everywhere. Why didn't you learn this in school? Why isn't this common knowledge that every parent passes down to their children? And that's actually a fascinating question with an answer that reveals something important about the nature of what we're dealing with here. For thousands of years, this understanding wasn't shared openly. It wasn't written in books that anyone could pick up at the marketplace. It wasn't discussed in public forums or taught to casual students. Instead, it was guarded carefully, transmitted only within intimate circles of people who had proven themselves ready, not just intellectually ready, but spiritually and emotionally mature enough to handle the responsibility that comes with this kind of empowerment. And before you think that sounds elitist or gatekeeping, understand that there was a very good reason for this protective approach. When you discover how to directly program your subconscious mind, when you learn to bypass all the normal protective mechanisms and plant seeds straight into the most receptive layer of your consciousness, you're working with something incredibly potent. It's not dangerous in the way a weapon is dangerous, but it requires wisdom in the way that any powerful tool requires wisdom. The masters who perfected these techniques over generations understood something crucial. Knowing that this is possible is very different from knowing how to use it responsibly and effectively. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Think about electricity for a moment. Billions of people know that electricity exists. We flip light switches every day, we charge our phones, we take it completely for granted. But knowing that electricity exists and knowing how to wire a building so that power flows safely to every room without burning the place down, those are entirely different levels of understanding. One is passive awareness, the other is active mastery. And in between those two levels is a lot of room for mistakes, for misapplication, for creating problems while trying to solve them. The same principle applies here, maybe even more so, because we're not talking about wiring a building, we're talking about rewiring consciousness itself. When someone first learns they can influence their subconscious mind at that threshold moment before sleep, the temptation is to immediately start throwing everything at it. They want abundance, perfect health, ideal relationships, creative genius, and spiritual enlightenment all at once tonight. And what happens? Nothing. Or worse than nothing, confusion, frustration, the sense that it doesn't work, that it was just another false promise. This is why the ancient teachers insisted on proper preparation. They didn't withhold knowledge out of cruelty or power hoarding. They understood that effectiveness requires precision, and precision requires understanding not just what to do, but why it works, what the underlying mechanism is, what the natural laws are that govern this process. Without that foundation, people stumble around in the dark, occasionally getting lucky with results, but never understanding why it worked that time and not another, never developing true mastery. And here's what those masters discovered through centuries of careful observation and testing. The mind at that threshold moment is like incredibly fertile soil. Whatever seed lands there will grow, but it can only grow one thing at a time with real power behind it. You can scatter 100 different seeds and get a confused garden of weak sprouts that never mature. Or you can plant one seed with absolute clarity and intention and watch it develop roots so deep that nothing can shake it loose, growing into something that transforms your entire landscape. This is the piece that modern self-help culture often misses in its rush to package everything into quick tips and instant solutions. There's a difference between being exposed to information and truly understanding how to activate it in your life. You can read 1,000 books about consciousness and transformation and still wake up every morning as the same person living the same patterns. Because reading about something and embodying the wisdom of it are two completely different journeys. One happens in your head, the other happens in the depths of your being where real change takes root. What I'm sharing with you right now isn't just information to collect and file away. It's an invitation to step into a different relationship with your own consciousness, to move from being someone who knows about these principles to someone who lives from them, who uses them deliberately every single night. And that transition, that bridge between knowing and activating, requires something specific from you. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to activate," if you feel that shift happening inside you. If you're sensing that this isn't just another video to watch, but a doorway you're choosing to walk through. So let's talk about something that's probably been nagging at you, maybe for years. You've read the books, haven't you? You've listened to the podcasts, watched the videos, attended the workshops, tried the techniques. You've got notebooks full of insights, shelves full of self-help titles, and a browser history that reads like a desperate search for the one piece of wisdom that will finally click everything into place. And yet, here you are, still struggling with the same core issues. Still feeling like true transformation, the kind that actually sticks, that changes you at a fundamental level, remains just out of reach. What's going on here? This is the great paradox of our time. We're swimming in an ocean of information about personal growth, consciousness, transformation. You can find 10 different experts giving you 10 different formulas for success before you finish your morning coffee. And yet, with all this knowledge at our fingertips, why do so many people feel stuck in the exact same patterns year after year? Why does genuine breakthrough seem to happen for some people but remain mysteriously elusive for others who are working just as hard, if not harder? The answer is both simpler and more profound than most people realize. The missing piece isn't found in learning more techniques or reading one more book or finally finding that perfect morning routine. The missing piece isn't even found in your waking hours at all. It's found in those hours when you appear to be doing absolutely nothing, when you're lying still, eyes closed, consciousness drifting. But where, beneath the surface of awareness, everything that matters is being fundamentally reprogrammed. Think about how much energy you've spent trying to change yourself during the day. You wake up with determination, you set intentions, you try to maintain positive thoughts, you battle against old habits using sheer willpower. And it works for a while, maybe. You manage to keep it together for hours, sometimes even days. But then something stressful happens, or you get tired, or you're just off your game for a moment, and suddenly you're right back in the old pattern. It's like pushing a boulder up a hill, exhausting, requiring constant effort, and the moment you let up, everything slides right back down. Now here's what makes all the difference, and this is the piece that finally completes the puzzle. During your waking hours, you're trying to make changes while your entire system is actively running. Every doubt, every fear, every limiting belief you've accumulated over decades, they're all online, all active, all pushing back against whatever new pattern you're trying to establish. It's like trying to renovate your operating system while all your programs are still running. The system fights you at every step because change feels like a threat to stability, to survival, to the known patterns that have kept you safe, even if they've kept you small. But when night comes and you cross that threshold into sleep, something miraculous happens. Every single one of those resistant forces powers down. The doubts that whisper, "You can't do this," they go quiet. The fears that remind you of every past failure, they dissolve into the darkness. The limiting beliefs that have been running your life on autopilot, they lose their grip entirely. All those barriers that during the day felt like concrete walls suddenly become nothing more than morning fog. And you know what happens to fog when the light hits it. It simply vanishes. This is why the nighttime approach to transformation is fundamentally different from anything you've tried during your waking hours. You're not fighting against resistance. You're working in a state where resistance doesn't even exist. The part of you that questions whether you deserve success, whether change is really possible, whether you have what it takes, that part is asleep. And in its absence, you have direct access to the deeper intelligence that actually runs your life, the part that doesn't argue or doubt or hesitate. It simply receives whatever you give it and goes to work making it real. Imagine trying to have a serious conversation with someone while they're constantly interrupting you, questioning every word, bringing up every time you were wrong in the past. That's what trying to change during the day feels like. Now imagine having that same conversation when the other person is simply listening with complete openness, no judgment, no resistance, just pure receptivity. That's the difference we're talking about here. Same message, completely different reception, and the reception is what determines whether your intention takes root or bounces off. The surface. What this means practically is that you could spend 100 hours of daytime effort trying to reprogram a limiting belief, or you could spend 7 nights planting the right seed at the right moment and accomplish the same transformation with a fraction of the struggle. Write in the comments, resistance is dissolving, if you're recognizing how much energy you've been wasting fighting battles during the day that don't need to be fought at all. Now, before you start thinking this sounds too mystical or abstract, let me ground this in something concrete. What we're discussing here isn't some new age concept that requires you to suspend disbelief or adopt a particular spiritual worldview. This is neuroscience. This is observable, measurable brain activity that happens in your skull every single night, whether you believe in it or not. Scientists have names for these states, equipment that can measure them, decades of research documenting exactly what happens when your brain shifts from waking consciousness into sleep. This isn't faith, it's function. There's a specific state that brain researchers call the hypnagogic state, and it occurs in that thin slice of time between being awake and being asleep. You've experienced it thousands of times without knowing it had a name or that it was anything special. It's that weird moment where you're not quite sure what's happening anymore. Are you still conscious? Are you dreaming? Your thoughts start to lose their linear quality and become more fluid, more imagistic. Your body feels heavy, like you're sinking into the mattress. Sounds might seem distant or distorted. Time gets strange. Was that 5 seconds or 5 minutes? This state lasts anywhere from a few seconds to maybe a minute or two, if you're particularly aware of it. And during this window, something extraordinary happens in your brain. Your neural activity shifts in measurable ways. The beta waves that dominate your waking thinking start to slow down. Theta waves increase. The boundaries between different areas of your brain become more porous. The prefrontal cortex, that part responsible for critical thinking and judgment, starts to quiet down. Meanwhile, other regions involved in emotion, memory, and subconscious processing become more active. What this creates is a state of consciousness unlike anything you experience during normal waking hours. Your mind is still aware enough to receive and process information, but the filtering mechanism that normally scrutinizes everything has gone offline. The gatekeeper has stepped away from the door, and for that brief window, whatever passes through doesn't get questioned or analyzed or compared to your history of failures. It simply gets absorbed directly into the deeper layers of your consciousness, where your beliefs about reality actually live. Scientists studying this phenomenon have discovered that people in the hypnagogic state show dramatically increased suggestibility. Not suggestibility in the sense that you'll believe anything someone tells you. That's not what we're talking about here. But suggestibility in the sense that your mind accepts input without the usual resistance, without engaging all the defense mechanisms that normally protect your existing worldview. And this isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's how your brain naturally allows for updates, for integration of new information, for adaptation to changing circumstances. Now here's what makes this so incredibly practical and powerful. This isn't some rare altered state you need special training or substances to access. You don't need to sit in meditation for years or learn complex breathing techniques or travel to a monastery in the mountains. You pass through this state naturally every single night, for free, without any effort whatsoever. It's built into your biology. The only difference between someone who uses this deliberately and someone who doesn't is awareness and intention. Most people blow right through this moment without even noticing it's happening. They're thinking about their to-do list for tomorrow, or replaying some conversation from today, or worrying about something completely outside their control. And they drift off to sleep with whatever mental noise was happening to run through their mind at that moment. And their brain, being the faithful servant it is, takes that mental noise, that worry, that replay, that anxious thought, and goes to work with it all, night long, reinforcing those exact patterns at the deepest level. But when you understand what this moment is, when you recognize that threshold as the doorway it actually represents, everything shifts. You stop wasting it on random mental chatter. You stop accidentally programming yourself with stress and limitation. Instead, you approach that moment with the reverence and intentionality it deserves. You wait for it. You feel it coming. And when you sense yourself crossing that threshold, when your body starts to feel heavy and your thoughts start to blur, you plant exactly what you want to grow. Write in the comments, "I recognize the threshold," if you're starting to identify that specific moment in your own nightly experience. So what actually happens in that moment when you cross the threshold? Let me paint this picture clearly, because understanding this changes everything about how you'll approach tonight and every night after. Throughout your entire day, your consciousness operates like a fortress under siege. Every new thought that tries to enter gets challenged at the gate. Every possibility has to prove itself against a mountain of evidence from your past. Every declaration of "I can" immediately triggers a committee meeting in your mind where all your doubts get to vote on whether that's actually true. This isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. Your brain has evolved to keep you safe by learning from experience and building protective walls around beliefs that seem to work, even if those beliefs are limiting you. So when you try to adopt a new identity during the day, when you stand in front of the mirror and affirm something that contradicts your current reality, what happens? That committee immediately convenes. That internal critic starts pulling files. Remember when you tried this before? Remember how that turned out? Who do you think you're kidding? And those voices aren't being cruel for the sake of cruelty. They genuinely believe they're protecting you from disappointment, from failure, from the pain of hoping for something and not getting it. So they shoot down anything that doesn't match your established pattern, and you end up stuck in the same loop no matter how many affirmations you repeat or vision boards you create. The fortress is doing its job, keeping everything the same, maintaining the status quo, protecting you right into stagnation. But then comes the night. And as you approach that threshold moment, as your body starts to relax and your thoughts begin to drift, something remarkable happens that you've probably never noticed before. Those guards at the gate, they clock out. That committee that questions everything, It adjourns. That internal critic with all its files and evidence, it goes silent. Not because you've convinced it or won the argument, but because it simply shuts down as a natural part of your transition into sleep. And what you're left with, in that moment of absolute quiet, is pure consciousness without defense mechanisms. Imagine you've been trying to plant a garden, but the ground where you're working is solid concrete. You can throw seeds at it all day long. You can water them, talk to them, visualize them growing. But nothing happens because the foundation itself won't allow growth. That's what trying to change during your waking hours feels like. You're throwing intentions at concrete, wondering why they're not taking root, not realizing the problem isn't your seeds. It's the surface you're planting them on. Now imagine one night you discover that just beyond this concrete pad, there's a patch of the richest, darkest, most fertile soil you've ever seen. Soil so alive with potential that anything you plant there doesn't just grow, it explodes into life with a vitality that seems almost supernatural. Seeds that would take months to germinate in ordinary soil sprout in days. Roots that would normally grow slowly suddenly drive deep with incredible force. What was impossible on the concrete becomes inevitable in this fertile ground. That's the difference we're talking about between planting intentions during your waking hours and planting them in that hypnagogic moment. Same seeds, completely different soil, and the soil makes all the difference. In that threshold state, there's no concrete layer of doubt. There's no hardened surface of past failures. There's just pure receptivity, consciousness in its most malleable state, ready to accept and integrate whatever you give it without question or resistance. This is why people who discover this secret often describe feeling like they've found a cheat code for life. Not because they're bypassing the work or taking shortcuts, but because they've finally found the one place where change doesn't require force, where transformation doesn't demand endless willpower, where becoming who you want to be isn't a battle against who you've been. They're finally working with their design instead of against it, planting seeds where seeds are meant to be planted, and then simply allowing the natural process to unfold. And here's what happens when you start doing this consistently. Those seeds you plant don't just sit there waiting for you to consciously nurture them through your day. They germinate while you sleep. They send roots down into the deepest layers of your subconscious while your conscious mind is completely offline. And by the time you wake up, something fundamental has already shifted. Not in some abstract spiritual sense, but in the actual neural pathways that determine how you perceive reality and respond to circumstances. Write in the comments, "I've found the fertile ground," if this metaphor is clicking for you, and you're seeing why all your previous efforts might have been aimed at the wrong surface. Let me give you a clearer picture of what's really going on inside your mind during your waking hours. Because once you see this mechanism clearly, you'll understand why so many of your attempts at change have felt like swimming upstream against a current you couldn't quite identify. Picture this. Standing at the entrance to your deepest consciousness is a guardian, not a malicious figure, but an incredibly dedicated, almost obsessively protective gatekeeper whose entire existence revolves around one mission: keeping you safe from harm, disappointment, and anything that might disrupt your survival. This guardian has been with you for years, maybe decades. It knows everything about you. Every mistake you've ever made is filed away in its archives. Every time you got hurt taking a risk, every moment of embarrassment when you tried something new and failed, every disappointment when hope turned to dust. All of it is meticulously documented, and this guardian uses that complete historical record to evaluate every single thought that tries to enter your consciousness. It's not trying to limit you out of spite. It genuinely believes that the best way to keep you safe is to make absolutely certain that nothing gets through that doesn't match what's already worked before. So when you stand in front of the mirror and try to declare, "I am abundant," what happens? that guardian immediately opens your file. It scans through your bank account history, your job performance, your spending patterns, every financial stress you've experienced. And then it presents you with a comprehensive report. Based on all available evidence, this statement does not match current reality. Suggestion denied. When you try to visualize yourself confident and successful, the Guardian pulls up every social situation where you felt awkward, every presentation where you stumbled, every time someone made you feel small. Current data does not support this identity shift. Request rejected. This happens so fast, so automatically, that you don't even notice it's a process. You just experience it as that sinking feeling, that subtle deflation, that voice in your head that says, "Who are you kidding?" And because it feels like it's just you thinking your own thoughts, you assume it's truth rather than recognizing it as a protective mechanism that's actually working against your growth while trying to keep you safe from disappointment. During your entire waking day, this guardian operates at maximum alert. It's like airport security cranked up to level 10, checking everything, questioning everything, cross-referencing everything against known threats. And here's the exhausting part. You can't argue with it. You can't logic your way past it. Because for every positive argument you make, it has 10 counterexamples from your own lived experience. You say, "But I could be different this time." And it shows you the last 5 times you said that exact thing and nothing changed. You say, "I'm ready to transform," and it reminds you that you felt ready before, and it didn't stick. This is why willpower-based change is so incredibly draining. You're not just trying to build new patterns. You're fighting against this guardian's interpretation of reality every single step of the way. It's like trying to walk forward while someone keeps pulling you backward, and that someone has access to your complete history as ammunition. They know exactly which memories to bring up, which fears to trigger, which doubts to amplify to keep you firmly planted where you are. And the truly frustrating part, this guardian is actually good at its job. From a survival perspective, staying consistent with proven patterns makes sense. If something worked before, even if worked just means didn't get you killed, then doing that same thing again is statistically safer than trying something untested. The problem is that this protection system, brilliant as it is, can't distinguish between actual physical danger and the discomfort of growth. To the Guardian, both feel like threats and both get the same treatment. Rejection at the gate. So you end up trapped in this paradox, where the part of you that most wants to keep you safe is actually the part that's keeping you stuck. And no amount of daytime effort changes this dynamic, because during your waking hours, that guardian is always on duty, always watching, always cross-checking your new intentions against your old results. It's working against you while genuinely believing it's working for you. And that makes it almost impossible to override through conscious effort alone. And this is where everything shifts. That guardian has to sleep too. Write in the comments, "My guardian is tired," if you're recognizing this protective mechanism in your own experience and you're ready to discover what happens when it finally steps aside. Here's the beautiful part that makes all of this immediately actionable tonight. You don't have to fight that guardian. You don't have to convince it or negotiate with it or somehow overpower it through sheer force of will. Because every single night, as naturally as the sun sets, that guardian steps down from its post. Not because you've earned it or proven yourself worthy, but because it's part of the fundamental design of how consciousness works. Just as your body needs to power down its active systems to heal and regenerate at the cellular level, your mind needs that protective mechanism to disengage so deeper processes of integration and reorganization can occur. Think about what this means. There's no battle to win here. There's no technique you need to master to make the guardian retreat. It happens automatically, built into your biology, as inevitable as breathing. The only question is what you're going to do with that moment when the door finally swings open and nothing stands between your intention and the deepest layers of your subconscious mind? Are you going to keep wasting it on whatever random thought happens to be drifting through your awareness? Or are you finally going to use it deliberately? Now, I want to show you what happens when someone discovers this truth through raw experience rather than intellectual understanding. Because there's something about seeing it play out in a real life that makes the concept click in a way that theory alone never can. Let me tell you about someone whose story perfectly illustrates both the problem and the solution we've been exploring. His name was Michael, and his situation was the kind that makes you wonder if some people are just cursed by fate itself. Michael came from a long line of silk merchants in Damascus. For generations, his family name had been synonymous with quality, prosperity, and success in the marketplace. His grandfather built an empire. His father expanded it. The business passed from father to son like a torch that always burned bright, and everyone assumed Michael would continue that legacy without breaking stride. But the moment the business landed in his hands, everything shattered. And I mean everything. It wasn't that Michael was lazy or incompetent. If anything, he worked harder than anyone in his family ever had, putting in longer hours, studying the trade more intensely, trying every strategy he could think of to turn things around. But every decision he made, and I mean every single one, somehow turned out to be exactly wrong. He'd invest in silk from one region, and that region would have a crop failure. He'd try a new marketing approach, and it would backfire spectacularly. He'd make a deal that looked perfect on paper, and it would dissolve into disaster before the ink dried. His competitors were thriving, selling the same products to the same customers. The market itself was fine. But Michael, it was like he was operating under some invisible curse that turned everything he touched into failure. And the worst part wasn't even the financial decline, though watching generations of family legacy crumble in his hands was devastating enough. The worst part was that he couldn't understand why. There was no logical explanation, no clear mistake he could identify and correct. It was as if the universe itself had decided he didn't deserve success, and no amount of effort or intelligence or dedication could overcome that verdict. His shop, which had once bustled with customers from dawn to dusk, now sat empty most days. The beautiful silks that used to fly off the shelves now hung faded and forgotten, gathering dust. And Michael himself had transformed from the confident young man who'd proudly taken over the family business into a hollow shell, carrying the crushing weight of failure he couldn't explain or escape. He was living proof that you can do everything right on the surface and still get everything wrong at a deeper level you can't consciously access. What Michael didn't know, what nobody had ever taught him, was that his real problem had nothing to do with business strategy or market conditions or even bad luck. His problem was happening every single night, in those moments, before he fell asleep, when he would lie there replaying every mistake, every loss, every way he'd disappointed his ancestors. Night after night, in that sacred window, when his guardian stepped aside and his deepest mind became perfectly receptive, he was planting seeds of failure, inadequacy, and unworthiness, and his subconscious, being the faithful servant it is, was taking those seeds and growing them into his lived reality with perfect precision. But Michael's story doesn't end in that dark place, and neither does yours. Write in the comments, "I'm breaking the pattern," if you're recognizing that you might have been doing something similar, programming yourself for the exact opposite of what you consciously want. The night that changed everything for Michael came when he had reached absolute rock bottom. He was sitting alone in his empty shop after another day without a single customer, seriously considering closing the doors forever and admitting complete defeat. The weight of disappointing generations of ancestors felt unbearable, And it was in that moment of total surrender, when he had nothing left to lose and no fight remaining in him, that something unexpected happened. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway of his shop. He hadn't heard her enter, hadn't seen her approach. She simply materialized from the evening shadows like she'd been waiting for this exact moment of his desperation. Her eyes carried a depth that suggested she'd seen this exact scenario play out many times before with many different people, and she knew something about it that Michael didn't. She didn't offer sympathy or encouragement. Instead, she asked him one simple question that cut straight through to the heart of everything. What do you tell yourself each night before you fall asleep? The question seemed almost irrelevant to Michael. What did his bedtime thoughts have to do with his failing business, his financial ruin, his inexplicable string of disasters? But something about the way she asked made him answer honestly. He told her that every night, as he lay in bed unable to escape his own mind, he replayed every mistake. He catalogued every wrong decision. He mentally listed all the ways he'd failed his family, his ancestors, himself. He fell asleep drowning in self-recrimination, convinced he was fundamentally broken in some way that explained why success came so easily to others but remained impossible for him. The elderly woman nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed exactly what she'd suspected. And then she said something that sounded absurdly simple, almost insultingly so, given the complexity of his situation. She told him about two words, just two ordinary words that exist in every language, that everyone uses constantly without recognizing their power. Two words that, when used correctly at the right moment, have the capacity to completely reprogram the deepest operating system of your reality. Those two words are I am, not as a simple statement of existence, but as a declaration of identity when spoken at that precise threshold moment between waking and sleeping. I am, followed by whatever you choose to claim as your deepest truth, not what you hope to become someday, not what you're working toward, but what you declare yourself to be right now in this moment, at the level where your subconscious mind writes the rules of what's possible for you. The elderly woman explained to Michael that his ancestors hadn't succeeded just because they understood silk or had good business sense. They succeeded because they knew something he'd forgotten, that every night in that sacred window before sleep, they declared their identity without the interference of doubt. They didn't beg the universe for prosperity. They didn't hope things would get better. They simply stated with absolute conviction in that moment of perfect receptivity, I am abundance. I am success. I am prosperity. And their subconscious mind, receiving that declaration without resistance, spent all night reorganizing their reality to match it. Michael listened to this with understandable skepticism. How could two words whispered to himself change the concrete reality of an empty shop, depleted inventory, and mounting debts? It sounded like magical thinking, like something desperate people cling to when they've run out of real solutions. But the elderly woman wasn't trying to convince him through argument. She simply offered him a challenge. Try it. For 7 nights. Just 7 nights. Every night, at that exact moment when he felt himself beginning to drift into sleep, whisper with as much conviction as he could muster, I am abundance. 7 nights. If nothing changed, he could return to his despair with evidence that it didn't work. But if something shifted, even something small, he would know he'd tapped into the same power his ancestors had always used. And here's what makes this story so powerful for understanding what we've been exploring. Michael's experience over those 7 nights reveals exactly how this mechanism works in practice, not just in theory. Write in the comments, I am ready to begin, if you're feeling that same mixture of skepticism and desperate hope that Michael felt, and you're willing to test this for yourself over the next 7 nights. That first night, Michael felt ridiculous. He lay in bed, feeling the heaviness of sleep approaching, and whispered to himself, "I am abundance," with as much conviction as he could muster, while his mind screamed that he was lying. His empty shop, his depleted savings, his string of failures all seemed to mock those two words. But he'd made a commitment for 7 nights, so he did it. And then he fell asleep, half hoping to wake up to some dramatic shift, half expecting to prove that it was all nonsense. The next morning arrived, and nothing had changed. His shop was still empty. His financial situation was identical. The sick feeling in his stomach, when he thought about his future, was exactly the same. Any reasonable person would have looked at this evidence and concluded the experiment wasn't working. But Michael had committed to 7 nights, not 1, so that second evening he did it again. He waited for that threshold moment and whispered, "I am abundance," even though his circumstances still screamed the opposite. The third night was perhaps the hardest. This is where most people quit, right here at this exact point. 3 nights of doing something that shows 0 external results feels like enough evidence that it's not working. The temptation to abandon the experiment and return to familiar despair is overwhelming. Michael's logical mind was telling him he was wasting his time, that words whispered to himself couldn't possibly change the concrete reality of his situation. But something deeper, maybe just the tiniest spark of hope he didn't want to extinguish, kept him going. Third night, same practice. I am abundance. And then sleep. Here's what Michael didn't understand yet, what most people never understand about transformation at this level. When you plant a seed in soil, if you dig it up after 3 days to check if it's growing, you won't see anything. The seed is still underground. It looks like nothing is happening. An impatient gardener would conclude the seed is dead, that the planting failed, that they're wasting their time watering empty dirt. But beneath the surface, everything is happening. The seed coat is softening. The root is forming. The entire mechanism of growth is activating in the darkness where you can't see it. The fact that nothing is visible yet doesn't mean nothing is working. Michael was at that 3-day point where the seed was doing its invisible work. Every night he planted that declaration in the most fertile soil that exists, his consciousness at the threshold of sleep. And every night his subconscious received it without resistance and went to work reorganizing his internal reality to match it. Neural pathways were being adjusted. Deep beliefs were being questioned. The architecture of his identity was being rebuilt at a level he couldn't consciously perceive. But none of this showed up yet in his external circumstances, and that's where faith becomes crucial. Not religious faith, but practical faith, the willingness to complete the process you started before judging whether it worked. Michael's entire daytime reality was still screaming failure at him. His rational mind had a mountain of evidence that nothing was changing, but he'd made a commitment to 7 nights, and something in him recognized that you can't fairly evaluate a process you haven't completed. It's like cooking a meal halfway and declaring the recipe doesn't work. You have to let it finish before you know what you're actually creating. So Michael continued. 4th night approaching, his shop still empty, his anxiety still present, his logical mind still skeptical. But that evening, as he prepared for sleep, something slightly different happened that he couldn't quite name. There was a subtle shift in how the words felt when he whispered them, a little less like lying to himself, a tiny bit more like remembering something true that he'd temporarily forgotten. Still no external evidence, still no customers, still no obvious signs of change. But internally, imperceptibly, the seed was sending its first root down into deeper soil. Write in the comments, "I trust the invisible work," if you recognize that the most important transformations always happen in the darkness before they emerge into light. The 4th night was when Michael first experienced evidence that something was actually happening, though not in the way he expected. He went through his now familiar routine, waiting for that drowsy threshold moment, whispering, "I am abundance," with growing conviction, and then surrendering to sleep. But what happened during the night was completely different from the previous 3 nights. He had a dream so vivid, so crystalline in its clarity, that when he woke up the next morning, he genuinely wasn't sure whether he'd been dreaming or experiencing some other kind of reality entirely. In this dream, he saw his shop transformed, not slightly improved, completely transformed. The silks weren't hanging faded and forgotten. They were radiant, catching light in ways that made them look almost alive. There were colors he didn't even stock in waking. Reality, shades that seemed to exist between the normal spectrum. And customers weren't just browsing, they were lined up, actually waiting for their turn to purchase from him. He could see their faces, hear their voices, feel the energy of commerce flowing through his space, the way it had in his grandfather's time. But here's what made this dream fundamentally different from the wishful fantasies he'd had before. Those daytime fantasies always had a quality of desperation to them, a "please let this be true" energy that betrayed his doubt. They were compensation dreams, his mind trying to escape painful reality by imagining something better. This dream felt nothing like that. It had a quality he'd never experienced before. Certainty, not hope, not wish, but knowledge. It felt less like imagining a possibility and more like remembering something that had already happened, or viewing something that already existed somewhere and was simply waiting to manifest in physical form. When Michael woke from this dream, his external circumstances were still unchanged. His shop was still empty, his bank account was still depleted. From any rational assessment, nothing about his situation had improved. But something in him had shifted so profoundly that he felt it in his body. That crushing weight of despair he'd been carrying for months felt lighter. Not gone, but definitely lighter. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something dangerous and unfamiliar rising. In his chest, anticipation. Not the desperate hoping of someone drowning and praying for rescue, but the quiet confidence of someone who knows relief is coming, even if they can't yet see it arriving. This is the moment where invisible work starts becoming visible internally before it manifests externally. The seed Michael had been planting for 4 nights had finally pushed its first shoot through the soil of his subconscious mind. It hadn't broken the surface of his external reality yet. His shop was still empty after all, but it had definitely sprouted. And that internal sprouting changes everything, because once you've felt that shift, once you've experienced that certainty that exists beyond logic and evidence, doubt loses its power over you. Michael didn't understand the mechanism of what was happening. He didn't have the framework we've been building together in this video. He just knew that something was different. The declaration, "I am abundance," no longer felt like he was trying to convince himself of something false. It felt like he was reminding himself of something true that external circumstances had temporarily obscured. That's a massive shift in orientation. He was no longer speaking against his reality, trying to overpower it with willpower. He was speaking from a deeper reality, one that was beginning to reorganize everything above it. That 5th day, Michael opened his shop with a different energy. He still had no logical reason to expect customers. His circumstances hadn't changed, but his internal state had. And internal state is what determines how you show up in the world, which determines what opportunities you're able to see and seize when they present themselves. And sure enough, that 5th day, something small but significant happened that would have seemed like meaningless coincidence to anyone watching from the outside, but felt to Michael like the first ripple of a wave that was building behind the scenes. Write in the comments, "The seed is sprouting," if you're understanding how change works from the inside out, how internal shifts always precede external transformation. On the 5th day, something happened that Michael might have dismissed as coincidence if it weren't for the internal certainty he'd been building over the past 4 nights. There was a man who walked past his shop every single day at roughly the same time. Michael had seen him hundreds of times over the months of his decline, always moving quickly, purposefully, eyes straight ahead, never even glancing at the silks in Michael's window. He was just part of the background, a regular feature of the street scene that Michael had stopped even noticing consciously. But on this 5th day, that man did something he'd never done before. He stopped, mid-stride, as if something invisible had reached out and grabbed his attention. He turned, looked at the silks displayed in Michael's window with genuine interest, and then walked into the shop. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael heard those beautiful words, "Tell me about these silks." It wasn't a huge sale. The man bought one modest piece, but the transaction itself wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the feeling Michael had during that interaction, a sensation that pieces of reality that had been misaligned for so long were finally clicking back into their proper positions. He felt different during that sale. Not desperate or grateful in the way you feel when you're drowning and someone throws you a rope. He felt natural, confident, like this was simply how things were supposed to be. Like abundance finding him wasn't an aberration, but a return to normal. And that shift in his internal state changed how he interacted with the customer, which changed how the customer responded to him, which changed the energy of the entire transaction. It was subtle. If you'd been watching from outside, you might not have noticed anything unusual. But Michael felt it. The frequency was changing. That night he whispered, "I am abundance," with a level of conviction that would have been impossible 3 nights ago. He wasn't trying to convince himself anymore. He was confirming what was beginning to reveal itself as true. And his subconscious mind, receiving that confirmation in the moment of maximum receptivity, accelerated the process of reorganization that was already underway. The seed wasn't just sprouting now, it was developing its root system, drawing nutrients, preparing for substantial growth. The 6th day brought something that pushed beyond the boundaries of what skeptics could easily dismiss as coincidence. Michael was arranging his display in the morning when a figure appeared in his doorway that he hadn't seen in over a year. It was an old business partner, someone who had distanced himself when Michael's failures became obvious. Someone who had every reason to avoid association with what looked like a sinking ship. Yet here he was, walking into the shop with an energy that suggested this wasn't a sympathy visit. This partner told Michael about a caravan that was arriving from the east, carrying silks of exceptional quality from regions known for their craftsmanship. The merchants leading this caravan were looking for local distributors they could trust, people with deep knowledge of the market and established reputations. And for reasons the partner couldn't quite articulate, he kept saying things like, "I don't know why, but I thought of you, and something told me you should know about this." He had come directly to Michael with this information before taking it anywhere else. This was exactly the kind of opportunity that could transform a struggling business overnight. Access to premium silks, a chance to re-establish credibility, a pathway back to the level of trade his family had always operated at. But what struck Michael most powerfully wasn't the practical opportunity itself. It was the uncanny resemblance to the dream he'd had on the 4th night. The silks in that dream, those colors that seemed to exist between the normal spectrum, they matched the descriptions his partner was giving him of these incoming goods. The energy of abundance, of customers seeking him out rather than him desperately seeking them, was beginning to materialize in 3-dimensional reality. Now here's what you need to understand about what was happening to Michael, because it reveals the mechanism that's available to you starting tonight. Write in the comments, "I see the pattern forming," if you're recognizing how internal shifts create external synchronicities, how changing your frequency changes what finds you. By the 7th day, Michael experienced something that went far deeper than any external circumstance could explain. When he woke that morning and looked at himself in the mirror while preparing for the day, he saw a different person staring back. Not different in any physical sense. His features were the same, his body unchanged, but the person behind those eyes was fundamentally transformed. The Michael who had started this experiment 7 nights ago was someone who wore failure like a heavy coat, whose entire identity had become wrapped up in disappointment and inadequacy. That person was gone. The Michael, looking back from the mirror, saw someone for whom abundance wasn't a desperate goal to chase, but a natural state to inhabit. He no longer felt like he was trying to become successful. He felt like success was simply flowing back to its proper channel after a temporary blockage. The crushing weight of his ancestors' disappointment had lifted not because he'd proven himself through some external achievement, but because his internal identity had shifted so profoundly that the old story of failure simply didn't fit anymore. It was like wearing clothes that were suddenly 3 sizes too small. He couldn't squeeze back into that old identity even if he tried. This is what 7 nights of deliberate programming at the threshold of sleep had accomplished. Not through force, not through willpower, not through positive thinking that battled against doubt. Through something much more elegant and powerful, direct communication with the part of him that actually writes the rules of his reality. 7 nights of planting the same seed in the same fertile soil at the same perfect moment. 7 nights of that seed sending roots deeper and deeper into his subconscious mind. And now on the 7th day, the transformation that had been happening invisibly beneath the surface was becoming undeniably visible in how he showed up, how he felt, who he knew himself to be. What had happened to Michael reveals a principle that operates in your life, whether you're aware of it or not. Your sleeping mind doesn't just passively receive whatever you give it and file it away like a computer storing data. It acts as an amplifier, a cosmic amplifier that takes the frequency you broadcast in that moment of perfect receptivity and multiplies it exponentially. Think about how a small electrical signal gets fed into an amplifier and comes out powerful enough to fill an entire stadium with sound. The original signal doesn't change its essential quality, but its impact becomes magnified thousands of times over. That's exactly what happens with the declarations you plant before sleep. When Michael whispered, "I am abundance," in that threshold moment, he was sending a signal, a frequency, an energetic instruction, and his sleeping mind took that signal and amplified it throughout every level of his being. His beliefs, his perceptions, his expectations, his behaviors, even his presence and energy that others unconsciously picked up on. What started as 2 whispered words became a complete reorganization of his internal reality, which then naturally reorganized his external circumstances to match. This amplification happens automatically. You don't have to understand the mechanism or visualize the process or do anything else to make it work. The amplifier is always there, always functioning, always ready. The only question is what signal you're feeding into it. Most people, like Michael before he met the elderly woman, are feeding in signals of fear, inadequacy, and failure every night without even realizing it. And the amplifier doesn't judge whether those signals are beneficial or harmful. It simply amplifies whatever it receives. So those people wake up day after day with their limiting patterns reinforced and strengthened, wondering why they can't seem to break free, no matter how hard they try during their waking hours. But when you consciously choose what signal to broadcast, when you deliberately plant a declaration of your highest identity in that moment of maximum receptivity, the same amplification process works in your favor instead of against you. The mechanism doesn't change. Your sleeping mind is doing the same thing it's always done. The Difference is that now you're giving it instructions that serve your growth rather than instructions that reinforce your limitations. Write in the comments, "My amplifier is set," if you're grasping how powerful it is to take conscious control of what you're programming into yourself every single night. Now let me show you another way to understand what we've been exploring, because sometimes a different metaphor makes everything click into place. Think about clay for a moment. When a potter works with clay during the day, especially in a hot climate, that clay is constantly being exposed to heat. The sun beats down on it. The air pulls moisture from it, and gradually, steadily, that clay hardens. It becomes rigid, inflexible, resistant to the potter's touch. If you try to work with clay that's been sitting in the heat all day, you know what happens? It cracks. It resists. It fights against your attempts to reshape it. The material itself has become locked into its current form. Your consciousness works exactly the same way. During your waking hours, you're constantly exposed to the heat of stress, the pressure of decisions, the friction of interactions, the glare of judgment from yourself and others. All day long, your identity is being baked harder and harder by these forces. Your beliefs become rigid, your self-concept becomes inflexible. The shape you've taken feels permanent, unchangeable, as solid as stone. And when you try to reshape yourself during these daylight hours, when you try to mold yourself into something different, you encounter that same resistance. The material has hardened. It doesn't want to move. But here's the beautiful part. When night comes, when the heat of the day finally dissipates and you enter that quiet space before sleep, something changes at the most fundamental level. Your consciousness begins to soften. Like clay that's been kept moist and pliable, like material that's been protected from the hardening effects of constant exposure, your identity becomes malleable again. The rigid structures loosen, the defensive walls lower, and for those precious moments at the threshold of sleep, you have access to consciousness in its most workable state. This isn't poetry. This is observation of actual psychological process. The difference between trying to change yourself at 3 in the afternoon versus 3 minutes before sleep is literally the difference between working with hardened clay and soft clay. Same material, completely different responsiveness. And the potters who understand this, who know to work with their material when it's most receptive rather than fighting against it when it's hardened, they create things that seem impossible to everyone else. There's a story that illustrates this perfectly, one that might seem unrelated at first, but reveals everything about the power of working in the darkness rather than the light. In a valley known for its pottery tradition, where generations of artisans had perfected their craft, there lived a man named Brian Mitchell. His work wasn't just skillful, it was inexplicable. Other potters in the valley created beautiful pieces, functional pieces, pieces that served their purpose well. But Brian's vessels possessed qualities that nobody could understand or replicate. Water stored in his pottery didn't just stay fresh, it tasted sweeter, more vital, as if the vessel itself was somehow enhancing the water's essential nature. Plants grown in his pots didn't just survive, they thrived with a vigor that defied botanical explanation, growing faster and healthier than identical plants in ordinary containers. Medicines prepared in his bowls seemed to work more effectively, as if the pottery itself was amplifying the healing properties. These weren't subjective impressions. These were observable, consistent effects that everyone in the valley acknowledged, but nobody could explain. The other potters studied Brian's techniques obsessively. They analyzed the clay he used, thinking he must have access to a special source. They examined his glazes, his firing temperatures, his tools. But every test showed he was using the same materials available to everyone else. The mystery wasn't in what he used, but in something else. Something that only became clear when someone finally observed when he actually did his work. Brian didn't work during the day like every other potter. He worked exclusively during the deep hours of night, shaping his vessels in complete darkness, guided only by touch and some kind of internal knowing that didn't require sight. And that single difference, the timing, the darkness, the state of consciousness he worked from, was making all the difference in the final result. Write in the comments, "I work in the darkness now," if you're beginning to see why the timing of when you do your deepest transformational work matters just as much as what you actually do. What Brian had discovered through years of nocturnal work wasn't just a preference for quiet hours. He had stumbled onto something the ancient masters of transformation had known for millennia, that there's a specific rhythm to deep change, a natural cycle that consciousness follows when it's being fundamentally restructured. And that cycle, whether you're working with clay or identity or any other form that needs reshaping, follows a pattern that takes exactly 7 complete cycles to establish permanent roots. 7 isn't some mystical number, chosen for symbolic reasons or religious tradition. It's the actual time required for a new pattern to embed itself so deeply in your unconscious mind that it becomes self-sustaining, no longer requiring your conscious effort to maintain. Think about it like building a fire. The first night you light it, you need to tend it constantly or it goes out. The second night, a bit less attention. By the third night, the coals are developing. By the 7th night, you have a bed of hot coals, so established that the fire sustains itself with minimal input. The pattern has taken hold. This is why Michael's transformation with the silk business followed a 7-night cycle. This is why traditional wisdom across cultures consistently points to 7 days as a meaningful unit of transformation. Your subconscious mind needs that specific amount of repeated input, planted consistently in that threshold moment each night, to fully reorganize around a new identity. Less than 7 nights, and the roots haven't gone deep enough. The old pattern can easily reassert itself, but 7 consecutive nights, that's the tipping point where the new pattern becomes stronger than the old one, where it shifts from something you're trying to create to something that's now creating itself. But here's where most people sabotage this process before it even has a chance to work. They approach it with the same scattered energy they bring to everything else. They lie down on the first night thinking, "I want abundance and perfect health and ideal relationships and creative genius and spiritual enlightenment and confidence," and they try to plant 15 different seeds in that moment and wonder why none of them grow. What they don't understand is that consciousness at the threshold of sleep, for all its receptivity and power, can only work with one focused intention at a time if you want real depth of transformation. It's like trying to dig 15 holes at once, each one barely scratching the surface, versus focusing all your energy on digging one hole deep enough to reach water. The first approach gives you a bunch of shallow indentations that fill back in with the first rain. The second approach gives you a well that continues providing what you need for years. Same amount of energy, completely different results, and the difference is entirely about focus. This is perhaps the hardest lesson for people in our modern culture to accept, because we're conditioned to believe that more is better, that we should be optimizing everything simultaneously, that success means having it all handled at once. But transformation doesn't work that way. Real, lasting, fundamental change requires you to choose one area where you're going to concentrate all your power for these 7 nights. Not because the other areas don't matter, but because trying to change everything at once guarantees you'll change nothing at depth. When you focus your nightly practice on one specific declaration, whether it's "I am abundance" like Michael, or "I am health," or "I am confidence," or whatever represents your deepest need right now, you're creating a concentrated beam of intention that can penetrate through all the layers of resistance and conditioning to reach the bedrock where your fundamental patterns live. And once you shift something at that level, everything built on top of it shifts automatically. Change the foundation, and the entire structure reorganizes itself. Write in the comments, "I choose my focus," if you're ready to stop scattering your energy and instead concentrate it into one powerful declaration that will actually create lasting transformation. So let me show you how this principle of focused nighttime work extends beyond just abundance or success. Because what we're really talking about here is a universal mechanism that applies to every area of human transformation, including the most fundamental one of all, your physical health and vitality. There's a story from the ancient healing temples that reveals something crucial about where real healing actually occurs. And it's not where most people think. In the temples of Epidaurus, where people came from across the ancient world seeking cures for conditions that seemed incurable, there was a woman named Rachel Garcia who worked the night shift. Her role wasn't glamorous. While the famous healers worked during the day administering treatments and medicines, performing elaborate procedures and gaining all the recognition, Rachel simply watched over patients while they slept. She was essentially a night guard, there to make sure people stayed comfortable and safe during the dark hours. Nobody considered her work particularly important to the healing process, but Rachel noticed something that all the daytime healers were missing. The patients who showed the most dramatic recoveries, the ones who healed from conditions that should have taken months or never healed at all, weren't necessarily the ones receiving the most powerful medicines or the most intensive treatments during the day. They were the ones who achieved the deepest states of sleep, who completely surrendered to the night, who let go so thoroughly that something beyond their conscious control could take over the healing process. She watched patient after patient, night after night, and the pattern became undeniable. The people who fought their sleep, who stayed partially alert and vigilant even while resting, who couldn't fully release their grip on conscious control, they healed slowly, if at all, no matter how good the daytime treatments were. But the ones who sank into that profound state of surrender, who crossed fully into deep restorative sleep, often showed improvement that seemed to defy medical explanation. Wounds that had been stagnant would suddenly start regenerating. Fevers that had persisted for days would break mysteriously during the night. Pain that had been constant would simply vanish by morning. What Rachel had discovered was that the body's deepest healing mechanisms only fully activate when consciousness releases its grip. When that protective guardian we talked about earlier finally steps aside and allows processes that operate beyond conscious understanding to do their work. The same principle that applies to transforming your identity or circumstances applies to healing your physical body. The real work happens in the darkness, in the surrender, in that state of consciousness that you only access when you stop trying to control everything. Now, on the other side of the ancient world, there was a man named Timothy Foster who was searching for similar answers, but looking in completely the wrong direction. Timothy was obsessed with the stars, with celestial alignments, with the movements of planets and constellations. He'd spent years in the observatories of Tibet, meticulously tracking how certain astronomical events seemed to correlate with periods when human intentions had amplified power to manifest into reality. He was convinced that the answer to conscious manifestation lay somewhere in the sky, in understanding the precise moments when cosmic forces aligned in your favor. He filled notebooks with calculations, created elaborate charts mapping stellar positions against reported manifestation successes, convinced that if he could just crack the code of celestial timing, he'd have the master key to transformation. But what Timothy was really doing was the same thing most people do, looking for answers outside himself, searching the external world for something that could only be found internally. He was studying the outer sky when he should have been studying the inner observatory, that vast space of consciousness that opens up each night when the external world finally fades away. The truth that Timothy eventually discovered after years of looking up when he should have been looking in was that the alignment that matters isn't happening in the positions of planets millions of miles away. Write in the comments, the alignment is within. If you're seeing that the power you've been searching for externally has always been waiting internally, accessible every single night when you finally stop looking outward and turn your attention to that threshold moment before sleep. The alignment Timothy was searching for in the stars was actually happening inside him every single night. That moment when his consciousness naturally shifted from waking to sleeping, when his frequency changed from the beta waves of active thinking to the theta waves of that liminal state. That was the cosmic alignment that mattered. Not something happening millions of miles away that he had to wait for and time perfectly, but something happening inside his own skull on a perfect schedule, available every single night without exception. Now let me show you one more dimension of this that brings everything together in a way that makes the practical application crystal clear. There was a baker in a small village, a woman named Stephanie Wilson, whose work had a quality that nobody could quite explain, but everyone could feel. Her bread didn't just nourish the body, it seemed to nourish something deeper. People who bought her loaves reported feeling more optimistic, more creative, more alive somehow after eating them. Families who shared her bread at dinner found their conversations flowing more easily, their connections deepening naturally. The other bakers in the village tried to figure out her secret. They assumed she must be using special flour or a unique fermentation process or some ingredient she kept hidden. But when they questioned her, she told them plainly that she used the same flour they all bought from the same mill, the same water from the same well, the same basic process that every baker knew. The only difference, she said, was that she prepared her dough exclusively during the deepest hours of night when the entire village slept. What she didn't tell them, what they wouldn't have understood anyway, was that while she worked in the ceremonial quiet of those midnight hours, she whispered specific declarations over each batch of dough. Not prayers asking for blessing, but statements of what the bread already was. This is nourishment for body and soul. This is sustenance that uplifts. This is transformation baked into every bite. And she made these declarations while she herself was in that altered state of consciousness that comes from working in deep darkness, when the boundary between her awareness and the dough she was kneading became fluid and porous. The dough rose because she rose first in consciousness. The bread transformed people because it was created by someone in a transformed state. This is the principle that connects all these stories we've been exploring. Michael and his silk, Brian and his pottery, Rachel and her healing observations, Timothy and his misguided stargazing. They all point to the same fundamental truth. Transformation happens first in consciousness, in that malleable state you access at the threshold of sleep, and then it extends outward into material reality. And this brings us back to where we started, to those ancient alchemists who spoke in coded language about turning lead into gold. They weren't actually trying to transform physical metals. That was just the metaphor they used to protect knowledge that would have been dangerous in the wrong hands. What they were really doing was transmuting the dense, heavy states of human consciousness, the lead of limiting beliefs, the corroded copper of self-doubt, the brittle tin of shattered confidence, into the gold of expanded awareness, infinite possibility, realized potential. And they discovered that this transmutation doesn't require years of study or complex rituals or rare ingredients. It requires one thing: the correct formula applied at the exact moment when your consciousness is most receptive to transformation. That formula is almost comically simple: 2 words, followed by your highest vision. I am. plus whatever you're choosing to become. Not I want to be, or I hope to be, or I'm trying to be. Just I am, spoken with certainty in that threshold moment when your sleeping mind accepts it as present truth rather than future aspiration. The lead of your fear transmutes into gold when you whisper, I am courage, at the edge of sleep. The copper of your limitation transmutes when you declare, I am abundance. The tin of your fragility becomes gold when you affirm, I am strength. Same consciousness, same mind, but transformed from dense to luminous, simply by planting the right seed at the right moment and letting your sleeping awareness do what it's designed to do. Reorganize everything around the new instruction. Write in the comments, I am transformed, if you're ready to begin this alchemical process tonight. So here we are, you and I, at the end of this journey we've taken together. And if you're still here, if you've stayed with me through Michael's transformation, through Brian's midnight pottery, through all these stories that reveal the same profound truth from different angles, then something inside you recognizes that this isn't just another video you happen to click on. This was meant to find you at exactly this moment in your life. Tonight is different now. You can't unknow what you've learned here. When you lie down and feel that familiar drift towards sleep, you'll recognize it for what it actually is, not just tiredness, but a doorway opening. And you'll have a choice that you didn't fully understand you had before. Let that moment pass unconsciously like you've done for years, or step through it deliberately with the two most powerful words in any language, I am. If this resonated with you, if you felt that shift happening inside you as we explored these ideas together, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel right now, because what we've covered today is just the beginning. There's so much more depth to explore, so many more dimensions of this nighttime transformation practice that we'll be diving into in future videos. You don't want to miss what's coming next. And leave a comment right now. Just write, I made it to the end, so I know you were here. So I know this message landed with someone who was ready to receive it. There's something powerful about declaring your presence, about marking this moment as significant. Do that now. If this video gave you something valuable, if it shifted your perspective even slightly, hit that like button. It's a small gesture that helps this reach others who are searching for exactly what you just found. And honestly, it lets me know that creating content like this, going deep, taking time, treating you like the intelligent person you are, is worth doing. Now, there's something else you need to see. There's a video right here that takes what we've discussed and shows you the specific technique, the exact words, the precise timing, everything you need to make this work starting tonight. Click on it and continue with me there, because knowing about this power and knowing how to activate it are two very different things. Let's close that gap together. I'll see you in the next one.